First off, thank you to the Resilience Institute for inviting me. I am aware of the burden on my shoulders. I have three things going against me. First, we are talking after lunch. People are already sleepy. Two, I am still recovering from jet lag, so I'll be a little sleepy. And third, we will be discussing economics, which is a topic that can be very challenging to focus on as well, but I shall endeavor to do my best. All right, so today I'm talking about and I will try to speak slower, being sensitive to the fact there is a translator. So we are talking about the maritime political economy in the Asia Pacific. I would like to begin by noting that by all accounts, the Asia Pacific or Indo-Pacific is expected to play a critical role in the future of the global economy. Many estimates put about 50% of world GDP in the Indo-Pacific by 2050. Most of the world's urban population, about half, is expected to be in the Indo-Pacific. And the working age population in Asia is expected to be roughly 3 to 4 billion people by 2040. Compare that with Europe, which is expected to only have 500 million. And in the United States, about 300 million people of working age by 2040. It shows you the enormous economic potential of Asia. Thank you for advancing. Please hold it on this slide. So to realize, thank you. To realize that potential, the maritime political economy will play an especially important role. Already, shipping accounts for the great majority of economic trade activity. As this slide indicates, seaborne trade has doubled every decade since 1945, and currently about 80% of global trade in goods occurs by sea. And shipping continues to be a very in-demand service, with the tonnage of ships doubling since 1990. Most shipping is containerized, and the map on the right shows where some of the most active ports for containerized shipping is located in East Asia. And as you can see, there's quite a bit going through the Malacca Strait and concentrated in the South China Sea. Next slide, please. Although there is enormous potential for economic growth in the Asia Pacific, and shipping will be important, there are obstacles to achieving that growth. Some of them are economic. In Asia, the richest economies are already aging quickly, and their growth rates are slowing dramatically. This includes China. China's population actually has declined in absolute terms starting this year, a full decade earlier than a lot of people expected. And its growth rate has been revised dramatically as well, to probably be half of what many people expected even as recently as 3 or 4 years ago. Through 2030, China's growth rate may slow down to about 2 to 3%, which is barely faster than the United States is expected to grow through that time period. Politically, and sorry, I should add, in terms of economic obstacles, the developing countries in Asia have huge infrastructure requirements, and there is simply insufficient funding to modernize a lot of the infrastructure required, including infrastructure related to ports and sea trade. There's inadequate funding for a lot of that development. Politically, we have already discussed many of the points of tension in Asia. China continues to seek conquest of Taiwan, which they claim to own. North and South Korea have failed to resolve their differences and remain in a military standoff. In the South China Sea, China has continued to build artificial islands and carry out activities of coercion against rival claimants. And in the East China Sea, there remains a standoff between China and Japan. Overlaying all these regional disputes is the broader competition for influence between China and the US, resulting in an environment of considerable tension and uncertainty. One reason why we are having this conference today is to see if there's some way to reconcile the economic potential of Asia with the political and economic hurdles that the region faces. We already discussed in the previous panel a lot of the political and security issues, so I will not address them in this presentation. Let's move on to the next slide. What I want to talk about instead are some of the economic initiatives that are being proposed as a way to overcome some of the hurdles and make full use of the potential for growth in the region. Leadership is required to help organize the regional economy of the Asia Pacific because there are many ways to try to maximize the potential of trade and build the infrastructure and manage the points of tension that are common throughout the region. But what kind of leadership and what kind of policies will be adapted? There are at least 3 major proposals that have been discussed. Some of them have been reviewed in the previous panel. I'm going to briefly discuss Belt and Road Initiative, again, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and the Geopolitical Fulcrum, which was proposed by Indonesia. Next slide, please. The Maritime Silk Road is the maritime component of the BRI, proposed around 2012, 2013. The map shows some of the routes that have been published in Chinese publications. The goal is to build infrastructure and promote trade and investment along the Southeast Asia, Indian Ocean routes connecting Africa and Eurasia to China. This overlaps with Chinese geopolitical ambitions. And here I want to emphasize that in Chinese writings, there is a clear perspective that economics cannot be separated from politics and security issues. The Chinese have stated over and over again that those who become economic partners with China must be ready to become security partners and political partners as well. And so those political and security ambitions cannot be divorced from the economic plans of the BRI. Next slide. The U.S. also has proposed an economic concept, Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. The governor discussed this in good detail in the previous panel, so I won't go into a lot of detail about it. There are 4 components. A main criticism of the IPEF is that it is not a traditional trade agreement. It does not offer the incentive of expanded market access that the previous Trans-Pacific Partnership offered. And so there are concerns about how far-reaching this is. IPEF is fundamentally driven by security concerns, and probably the feature that is most attractive to countries is the feature about supply chain security and resilience. This involves a number of proposals to help countries notice and detect early on when there are serious vulnerabilities and to build resilience into their supply chains. But the other aspects of the IPEF primarily deal with simplifying procedures to speed up trade and cooperation and incentives to promote shared goals like expanding green energy initiatives and reducing corruption. There's no question that the IPEF is tied to American goals of maintaining its influence, and it is not a surprise that most of the countries that have signed on have been primarily American allies and friends, but there are other countries who are not necessarily American allies who have signed up, including Indonesia, due to their interest in one or more of these proposals or parts of this proposal. Last point I would make about the IPEF is that this is a modular agreement. It is not an agreement that requires acceptance of all four aspects. Countries can pick and choose which of the four aspects they would like to accede to, and in fact that is what has happened. Some of these aspects, of the four, some of these four features have moved faster towards agreement than others, and that is by design. Next slide, please. ASEAN has not been passive in thinking about how to build the maritime political economy, and Indonesia in particular has, at least as of 2014, actively promoted a vision for realizing the economic potential of the area. The geopolitical fulcrum was proposed by Indonesian President Joko Widodo. My understanding is that the status of this is debated. Parts of it appear to have moved forward into government policy, and other parts is less clear. Nevertheless, I think the significance here is that countries in ASEAN realize that they don't have to choose what the US or the Chinese are offering, but they can be very active in shaping the choices and proposing their own choice. And in fact, I would like to suggest that that is, I think, an important way for us to think about how we can build in a stable manner a framework for realizing the economic potential of the region. Next slide, please. So if we have these three options, and the US and Chinese options have the most resources behind them, there's, I think, at least two ways to consider how to respond to these options. The first option I call the menu option. And this is the idea, I think someone mentioned in the previous presentation, the idea of choosing right or left. This is the idea of choosing either wholesale the Chinese approach and signing up to Chinese economic leadership, political leadership, security leadership, or signing up with the US political, economic, security leadership, one side or the other. That's the menu option. The other possibility I suggest is what I call a la carte. This is the idea of countries selecting from both menus, whichever one suits them best, and not caring so much if they choose one side or the other. Both of these options have advantages and disadvantages. The first option, the menu option, one country can choose to be a good friend of either China and the United States and reap all the benefits of being the friends of that country. But the drawback is you will antagonize the rival and anger them. In the a la carte option, you have the advantage of more flexibility, and probably a better chance of having your own needs met, but your relationship with both China and the United States could be more full of friction and more risky and less stable. In my analysis, what I am seeing countries do is gravitate more towards the latter option as probably the option that serves their interests best. And I think that's probably a very reasonable approach. But let's explore this more in detail. Next slide. So what I'm going to do in the last several slides is consider how the a la carte approach, which countries seem to be doing, can help address some of the issues of the maritime economy. As I mentioned, one of the needs is infrastructure. Indonesia has a tremendous number of needs for building ports and maritime transportation infrastructure. And the geopolitical fulcrum identified infrastructure as a top priority, understandably. China has offered generous funding to build some ports, certainly more than the US has offered. And in many ways, China is an attractive partner and I think a reasonable choice for a partner like Indonesia to adopt at least some projects for infrastructure development. The US offers about infrastructure are generally pretty limited and mainly involve incentives to try to attract private investor funding. In this case, China could be a good choice for a country who needs infrastructure and a generous sponsor like China. Next slide. On the other hand, fisheries and resources are another important part of the maritime economy. Indonesia has a large fisheries industry, and finding ways to ensure stable fisheries is important for economic growth and the maritime economy of Indonesia. China has offered to be a partner, but it is clear from the Chinese ideas and their behavior that one of the prices of cooperation with China will be that countries like Indonesia must accept and tolerate Chinese illegal, unreported, and unlawful fishery activity in their area. The US, by contrast, has offered to help countries like Indonesia more effectively police their fisheries and regulate such fishing activity. This proposal undoubtedly has angered and irritated China, but given Indonesia's own needs, it seems the United States is probably a more helpful partner on this issue than China. Next slide. Trade, another important part of the maritime political economy. China is a top trade partner of Indonesia. They have promoted the RCEP, Regional Cooperative Economic Partnership, which was signed in 2020 and became active as of this year. There is still a lot of debate as to how much countries like Indonesia and other ASEAN countries will actually benefit from RCEP. There's more evidence to suggest China will benefit greatly due to its ability to access markets for its industries. But nevertheless, certainly China is a huge market and there is potential for Indonesian producers. The US has not offered a trade agreement ever since the failure of the TPP, and the IPEF does not offer a meaningful change in access to US markets. The US has instead tried to offer updated rules for some of the cutting edge industries like digital technologies and digital services. And the US rules, in the eyes of many experts, is probably more comprehensive than what the Chinese are offering in RCEP. It is possible that participation in both Chinese trade initiatives and IPEF would benefit countries like Indonesia the most. Next slide. So to conclude, countries like ASEAN, who are divided and unlikely to come to a consensus in either supporting fully a Chinese comprehensive approach to maritime economy or U.S. approach, are likely to find, and indeed arguably are already finding, the best way to navigate these competitive proposals is to, first off, articulate clearly what are ASEAN's needs and the needs of individual countries. Second, to select from either side what serves their interests best and disregard the idea of fully endorsing one side or the other. And then recognize that at the end of the day, both the US and China are interested in playing a role in the revival of Southeast Asia's economy and have a strong incentive to find ways of making this work. I'm not discounting the possibility that some of these political tensions that we discussed in the previous panel could prove problematic, but the more actively countries in ASEAN engage with the US and Chinese in clarifying what their economic needs are, which proposals are most use to them, and which ones are least use to them. In my analysis, that offers the most promising prospect of achieving the shared goal of bringing about prosperity in the region. Thank you.